The town of Briarwood had always been the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where front porches sagged under the weight of memory and small-town gossip traveled faster than the train that hadn't run through in decades. But even in such a place of familiarity there were stories that people never expected to see unfold before their eyes, and one of those stories began quietly with an elderly man named Walter Briggs, a war veteran whose hair had long turned silver and whose back bore the invisible weight of both battles fought overseas and years endured in silence, because Walter had been the kind of soldier who returned from the world's chaos only to find himself living in a society that slowly forgot the men who had given everything. He lived alone on the edge of town in a small, crumbling farmhouse, where weeds climbed higher than his porch railings and the sound of his cough was sometimes the only reminder that someone still resided there, and while the younger generation of Briarwood barely remembered what he had done, the older townsfolk spoke of him with a kind of quiet respect, because once upon a time Walter had been strong and proud, carrying medals on his chest that shone like the sun, but years of loneliness had dimmed that shine until he became almost invisible to the town, just another elderly man walking with a limp, clutching his cane, and fading into the background. And so when the shocking day arrived that he was found chained to a tree at the edge of the courthouse lawn, the entire town's heart stopped because no one could believe such a thing had happened, and the story of how it all began was as heartbreaking as it was enraging, because Walter hadn't simply ended up there by chance, but rather through a cruel twist of neglect and malice that would shake Briarwood forever. It had started with a small argument at the local diner where Walter, quiet but proud, had spoken up against a group of younger men who mocked his limp and called him names they had no right to speak, men too young to know the cost of freedom, men too careless to realize that their laughter stabbed deeper than any shrapnel, and though Walter had simply told them to show respect, the situation escalated until one of them, drunk on arrogance, decided to teach the old man a lesson, and in the days that followed, they cornered Walter on his walk home, dragged him out toward the courthouse lawn where the Veterans Memorial stood, and in an act of cruelty no one in town would soon forget, they bound his frail body to the old oak tree there, chaining him like an animal, as if mocking the very sacrifices that gave them the right to walk free. For hours Walter remained there, unable to free himself, his frail hands tugging against cold steel while the sun burned down on his weary shoulders, his breath shallow, his mind spinning back to the days of war when he had been tied down in enemy territory, and yet this moment somehow cut deeper because this time it was not an enemy overseas but his own countrymen humiliating him. People passed by, some too stunned to act, some thinking perhaps it was a strange protest or prank, until Sheriff Tom Harlow was alerted by a frightened child who tugged at his sleeve, whispering about an old man stuck to a tree, and that was when the sheriff came running with his loyal German shepherd, Duke, a dog known in the town almost as well as his master, and what happened in the next few minutes would forever be remembered as the moment when a dog's instincts and loyalty revealed not just the cruelty of the act but the humanity, or lack thereof, of those who had let it happen. Sheriff Harlow had seen many things in his years of service, but the sight of Walter, his face pale, sweat dripping, chains cutting into his skin, was one that made his throat tighten with anger, and before the sheriff could even step closer, Duke reacted with a growl that vibrated through the air, his sharp eyes narrowing at the heavy padlock and the cruel chains, his body tense with both fury and purpose, and in one swift motion the dog lunged forward, pulling at the chains with his powerful jaws, tugging, biting, refusing to stop despite the metallic taste and the risk of breaking his own teeth, until the townspeople gathered, gasps and murmurs spreading like wildfire, some recording on their phones, some covering their mouths in shame, because in that moment it wasn't just about freeing Walter, it was about witnessing loyalty, courage, and raw instinct from an animal that seemed to understand injustice better than many humans did. And as Duke pulled and growled and shook the chain, Walter, through cracked lips, whispered hoarsely, good boy, his voice breaking with gratitude, tears streaking down his weathered cheeks, because in that act of desperation and devotion he felt something he hadn't felt in years, someone fighting for him, refusing to let him be forgotten, refusing to let him suffer alone. The sheriff finally stepped in, using his cutters to break the lock, but by then Duke had done most of the work, weakening the link so that the last snap echoed like a gunshot of victory, and as the chains clattered to the ground, Walter sagged against the tree, free yet trembling, his knees buckling until the sheriff caught him under the arms and held him upright. The crowd erupted in both applause and shame, some crying, some shouting at the cruelty of those responsible because the image of an old soldier chained in broad daylight was too much for the conscience of Briarwood, and yet, amid all the noise, it was Duke who stood tall, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Walter as though assuring him he was safe now, that no harm would come again. And in that instant the town realized something that words alone could never capture. that sometimes it takes the pure heart of a dog to remind humans of their duty, of their compassion, and of the respect owed to those who gave everything for their freedom. And as Walter, exhausted but alive, was carried gently into the courthouse lobby to rest, the seed of a story was planted that would ripple through every home, every heart, because what had begun as cruelty was now turning into a lesson that no one in Briarwood would ever forget. As Walter was laid gently on a bench inside the courthouse lobby, the murmurs of the gathered townspeople still carried through the open doors like a restless wind, and Sheriff Tom Harlow's jaw tightened as he realized that this incident could not be treated as a simple case of mischief or childish prank, because this was cruelty of the worst kind, inflicted upon a man who had once bled for the same flag that now hung outside the courthouse on its tall pole swaying in the summer heat. And when Tom turned back toward the old oak tree where the chains lay coiled like the discarded skin of a serpent, Duke stood there still, pacing around the metal links as though guarding evidence of the crime, his growl low and steady, a sound that unnerved those who had gathered too close, because Duke seemed to know that this was not over, that somewhere nearby the guilty men who had done this were either laughing in cowardice or hiding in fear, and Tom knew he had to find them before nightfall. Walter, struggling to breathe, asked in a hoarse whisper for water, and one of the courthouse clerks rushed to fetch a glass, holding it gently to his cracked lips, and as the cool liquid touched his tongue he sighed with such a mix of relief and sadness that it broke the hearts of those who watched, because they saw not just an old man recovering from an ordeal but a soldier who had endured more pain in one lifetime than most would in three. And when his shaking hand reached to stroke Duke's head, the dog leaned close, pressing against Walter's frail body as if lending him strength, as if promising that nothing like this would happen again, and for the first time in years Walter felt the warmth of loyalty wrap around him like a shield stronger than any chain. Sheriff Tom, meanwhile, was already piecing things together in his head, recalling the reports from the diner earlier in the week about a heated exchange between Walter and a group of younger men who had been drinking too heavily, and while many townsfolk had dismissed it as harmless words, Tom knew in his gut that these were the same men responsible, and the thought made his stomach churn with anger. So he stood tall, addressing the crowd, his voice firm and echoing through the marble lobby, telling them that what had been done was not only an assault on a frail old man but an insult to every veteran, every family, every principle that held Briarwood together. And as his words rang out the crowd responded with nods, shouts of agreement, and a rising tide of outrage that surged like a river breaking its dam, because they realized that in their quiet indifference they had allowed cruelty to walk unchecked among them. Some people shifted uneasily, ashamed that they had walked past Walter earlier and done nothing, others wiped away tears, while the youngest in the crowd asked questions to their parents in hushed voices, questions about what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to honor, and the answers they received would ripple into the future as lessons never to be forgotten. But for now the focus was on justice, and Sheriff Tom declared that he would find those responsible and bring them before the town, and that no act of cruelty would be swept under the rug. Duke barked once, sharp and commanding as if sealing the vow, and Walter managed the faintest smile despite the pain in his ribs, because he felt for once that he was not forgotten, not invisible, not alone. But as the sheriff began his search, moving through Briarwood's backstreets and questioning those who had seen the group of young men in recent days, tension grew like storm clouds over the town, and whispers filled the corners of shops and kitchens. Who could do such a thing, and why had no one stopped them sooner? The truth was that Briarwood had, over the years, become a place where respect for the past had withered under the weight of modern indifference, and Walter's suffering was the mirror they all now had to face, a reminder of their own failures. And as evening shadows stretched across the courthouse lawn, torches of determination lit in the hearts of many who vowed never again to turn away when someone cried for help. Meanwhile Walter, resting in the courthouse infirmary, drifted in and out of consciousness, flashes of memory pulling him back to battlefields of mud and fire, hearing the shouts of comrades long gone, the clatter of gunfire, the sting of captivity when he had once been bound behind enemy lines, and though his body was weak his spirit stirred with old resilience, because something in Duke's eyes had reignited a flame inside him, whispering that perhaps his story was not yet finished, that perhaps he had one last lesson to give this town, one last fight not on foreign soil but here at home, where honor had been neglected and now needed to be reclaimed. Sheriff Tom's investigation led him to the edge of town, to a rundown garage where the group of men often gathered, and sure enough he found them there, laughing nervously, bottles scattered around, their bravado cracking when Duke growled from the sheriff's side, teeth bared like a living sword of justice. The men's excuses spilled out quickly, words like joke, and didn't mean no harm, but Tom's glare silenced them, because there was no excuse that could wash away the image of chains around a veteran's body, and he ordered them to stand against the wall, cuffing each one while Duke never broke eye contact, as though imprinting guilt into their very souls. The crowd gathered again as the culprits were led through town toward the courthouse, and this time the townsfolk did not look away. They jeered, they shouted, some demanded punishment harsher than the law would allow, but what struck deepest was the silence of Walter himself, who, though still weak, asked to be wheeled out onto the courthouse steps to see the faces of those who had wronged him, and when his sunken eyes met theirs, the young men flinched as if struck by lightning, because in that frail body burned a dignity they could never tarnish, and the shame of their actions weighed heavier than any chain. And then, in a voice cracked yet strong, Walter told the crowd that justice was not just about punishing the guilty but about remembering the duty owed to every man and woman who had sacrificed for their freedom, and that if his suffering could awaken their hearts, then perhaps it had not been in vain. And the crowd erupted not in noise but in solemn silence, heads bowed, realizing the depth of what they had allowed to happen. Sheriff Tom promised that the law would take its course, but he also knew that this was bigger than court dates and sentences. This was about the soul of Briarwood, and that soul had been tested and nearly lost, until a dog had reminded them all of their humanity. That night in Briarwood, as the culprits sat in the cold jail cells awaiting their hearings, the courthouse still carried the echo of what had happened, the oak tree outside standing tall like a silent witness, its roots deep in history, its branches stretching as if to shelter the memory of Walter's ordeal, and within the infirmary Walter lay under a thin blanket, his breathing shallow but steady, while Duke rested faithfully at the foot of his bed, his ears twitching at every sound as though he were both guard and companion. Sheriff Tom sat nearby watching them both, his mind heavy with thoughts, for he knew that while justice in the legal sense would play its part, the greater justice was still unfolding in the hearts of the townsfolk, many of whom could not sleep that night, haunted by the sight of an old veteran bound in chains under their very noses. 4 years they had driven past Walter's crumbling farmhouse without a second glance, dismissing him as just another forgotten old man, but now, after what they had witnessed, guilt gnawed at them like termites in wood, and a determination grew quietly in the town, to make amends, to show the respect they had neglected, to ensure Walter's final years were not marked by loneliness and neglect but by dignity and remembrance. Walter, drifting between dreams and consciousness, found himself visited by memories he had tried long to bury, of comrades who never came home, of nights in foreign trenches where the cold seeped into his bones, of mornings when letters from home were the only warmth to be found, and though age had stolen his strength, the faces of those who had fallen remained sharp in his mind, and he whispered their names softly into the dark, unaware that Duke's ears perked each time, the dog lifting his head as though understanding that his master was speaking to ghosts, keeping them alive in fragile words. The next morning the town gathered again, not out of morbid curiosity but out of a sense of collective duty, as people of all ages stood outside the courthouse waiting for word of Walter's condition, bringing food, blankets, flowers, anything to show support. And when Sheriff Tom stepped out to address them, he was surprised to see how many had come, from children holding handmade signs that said, "Thank you, Walter," to elderly neighbors clutching old photographs of their own relatives who had served. And the sheriff realized then that the cruelty of a few had awakened the conscience of many, and that sometimes a wound inflicted on one could heal the hearts of an entire community. Inside, Walter stirred awake to see not just the sheriff but also the mayor, the pastor, and several townsfolk filing in to pay respects, their faces heavy with shame and gratitude, and though Walter's voice was weak, he managed to say, "I don't need pity, just promise me you'll remember," and those words struck deeper than any sermon because they carried the weight of every soldier's plea, that their sacrifices not be forgotten in the rush of time. Duke, sensing the shift, stood proudly beside Walter's bed, tail thumping softly, and it was decided then and there that the town would hold a ceremony at the courthouse lawn, not to erase the cruelty that had happened but to reclaim the space as one of honor, and Walter would be at the center, not as a victim but as a living reminder of courage and resilience. In the days leading up to it, Briarwood transformed. Neighbors who had once looked past Walter began stopping by his farmhouse to repair the broken shutters, to cut the overgrown weeds, to bring hot meals and sit with him in conversation. And for the first time in decades Walter's home was filled with voices, laughter, and light, and though he was frail, he felt stronger than he had in years because the burden of invisibility had been lifted, and he realized that even in old age one could still teach a community the value of remembrance. Sheriff Tom continued to keep a close eye on the young men responsible, knowing their trial would come soon, but he also noticed how Duke had become something of a symbol in town, with children drawing his likeness in chalk on sidewalks and parents pointing him out as the dog who had saved a man's life, and in Duke's steady gaze they saw a purity of loyalty that shamed human indifference, reminding them all of what it meant to stand by someone in their darkest moment. When the day of the ceremony arrived, the courthouse lawn was transformed, the oak tree adorned not with chains but with ribbons and flags, photographs of veterans placed at its roots, candles flickering in the breeze, and the entire town stood gathered as Walter, wheeled out by Sheriff Tom and accompanied by Duke at his side, took his place beneath the branches where once he had been bound. The hush that fell over the crowd was profound, for in that silence they honored not just Walter but every soul who had suffered silently, every soldier who had stood tall only to be forgotten. Walter, his voice still thin but steady, spoke to them of sacrifice, of loneliness, of the duty to care for one another, and as he spoke Duke sat at attention, ears forward, as if understanding the gravity of every word, and when Walter's speech ended, the town erupted not in loud applause but in a quiet, unified murmur of respect, a sound that felt like healing. That night, when Walter returned to his farmhouse, he found it no longer empty, for townsfolk had left gifts, cards, even an old record player repaired so he could hear the songs of his youth, and for the first time in years he felt that his service, his suffering, his life, had meant something not just in the past but in the present, because finally his community had remembered him. Yet as Walter sat on his porch with Duke's head resting against his leg, he also knew this was not the end of the story, because the trial of the men who had chained him still lay ahead, and whether Briarwood had truly learned its lesson would be tested in how they chose to deal with justice, not just in words but in action. The weeks that followed carried Briarwood into a season of reckoning, for the trial of the young men who had chained Walter to the oak tree became the central heartbeat of the town, drawing crowds larger than any fair or festival, because what had happened was no longer seen as just an assault on one man but a test of the community's conscience, a chance to prove whether they truly stood for honor and justice or whether they would allow cruelty to slip by with excuses and half-hearted apologies. And in those tense days the courthouse halls echoed with footsteps of reporters, veterans, townsfolk, and strangers alike, all eager to witness how a small town would respond to such a wound. Walter himself, though still weak, insisted on attending the hearings, his body trembling with effort yet his spirit unwilling to be silenced, and every morning Sheriff Tom or a neighbor would wheel him into the courtroom, with Duke walking faithfully at his side, head held high, his calm but vigilant presence unnerving the guilty men at the defense table, for they could not escape the gaze of the animal who had torn at their chains and revealed their cruelty to the world. The courtroom atmosphere was thick, every cough or shuffle magnified as the prosecution laid out the story, the diner altercation, the cornering on the road, the binding to the tree, and each detail sent ripples of anger through the audience, for to hear it spoken aloud, documented and undeniable, was to relive the shame of it, and when witnesses testified, some admitting with tears that they had seen Walter chained but had not acted out of fear or confusion, the weight of their regret added to the gravity of the moment, reminding everyone how silence could be as dangerous as cruelty. The defense tried their best to frame the men's actions as a drunken prank gone too far, but each time they spoke words like joke or misunderstanding, Walter's weary eyes closed in pain, and Duke's low growl rumbled through the chamber, silencing the lawyers more effectively than any gavel could, until even the judge remarked that this case was not about excuses but about responsibility. The townsfolk who once walked past Walter's farmhouse without care now filled the pews, leaning forward in collective anticipation, their expressions hardened with a determination that no slap on the wrist would be enough, because they had come to see Walter not as a forgotten relic of the past but as the embodiment of every value they claimed to uphold, and to betray him now would be to betray themselves. During one session, Walter was asked to speak, and though the courtroom fell into complete silence, fearing his frailty, he lifted his head, his voice cracked but carrying the weight of decades, and he told the story not just of that terrible day but of his life, the sacrifices made in muddy trenches, the friends buried in foreign soil, the long nights of loneliness when the world moved on without him, and he ended by saying that while he did not wish vengeance upon the men who had wronged him, he demanded that the town recognize the deeper crime, the forgetting of those who served, the neglect that had allowed him to fade into invisibility until cruelty struck him down. His words were like thunder rolling through the hearts of everyone present, and when he fell silent even the judge had to pause, wiping his eyes discreetly before continuing the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, crowds held vigils by the oak tree, placing flowers and notes at its base, turning the sight of shame into one of honor, and Duke, whenever led outside, would sniff each offering, sit by the trunk, and watch the people as though ensuring that the space remained sacred. Children would pat his head and whisper thanks, as if knowing he had become more than just a dog but a guardian of their town's conscience. As the trial neared its end, tension reached a peak, and the guilty men, their bravado long gone, sat slumped, realizing that whatever sentence awaited them, their names would be marked by this disgrace forever. and perhaps that weight was heavier than any jail term, for they had not only wronged Walter but had revealed their own hollowness to the world. When the verdict was read, guilty on charges of assault, false imprisonment and public humiliation, the courtroom erupted in a murmur of relief, and while some demanded harsher punishment, Walter raised a frail hand, asking for silence, and he said that though justice in the court was necessary, true justice would come only if Briarwood remembered its lesson, if the town never again allowed neglect to erase the dignity of its elders, its veterans, its forgotten souls. The judge, moved by Walter's plea, sentenced the men to both prison time and years of community service, specifically aiding elderly veterans, declaring that their punishment should not only confine them but also teach them, and this decision, though controversial to some, was seen by most as a balance between consequence and redemption, a reflection of Walter's own refusal to harbor bitterness. After the gavel struck, Walter was wheeled out into the courthouse steps where the crowd cheered not with joy but with respect, and as Duke stood tall beside him, his eyes gleaming in the sunlight, it felt as though the entire town had been reborn, united not by pride but by humility and shared resolve. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and crimson, Walter sat once more on his farmhouse porch with Duke at his feet, the noise of cicadas filling the air, and for the first time in decades he felt at peace, not because the chains had been broken, not because the guilty had been punished, but because he had seen his town awaken, had seen its people remember, and he knew that when his time finally came, he would not pass as a forgotten shadow but as a man whose suffering lit a flame in the hearts of others, a flame kept alive by the loyalty of a dog and the conscience of a community finally stirred. That in the weeks after the trial, Briarwood seemed like a town transformed, for where once the streets had carried an air of quiet indifference, now they buzzed with small but meaningful acts of kindness inspired by the ordeal of Walter Briggs, and at the center of it all stood the frail veteran and his steadfast companion Duke, who had become almost mythical in the eyes of children and adults alike, because every time people saw Walter walking, or more often being wheeled, through town with Duke trotting loyally at his side, they were reminded not just of what had happened but of what it meant to protect, to respect, and to remember. Walter's farmhouse, once sagging and neglected, became a symbol of renewal as volunteers repaired the roof, painted the walls, and planted flowers along the porch, and though Walter protested at first, muttering that he didn't need charity, the truth was that the company and warmth filled him with a happiness he hadn't known in years, and at night when he sat on the porch with Duke resting his head against his knee, Walter whispered to the dog that maybe, just maybe, he had been kept alive all these years to witness this very change. Children visited often, drawn to Duke's friendly demeanor, and Walter found himself telling them stories, real ones of his youth, his service, his fallen brothers in arms, and though he softened the darker details, he taught them about sacrifice and loyalty, weaving lessons into tales that fascinated their young minds, and in return they brought him laughter, drawings, and even cookies baked with clumsy hands, filling his lonely farmhouse with the echoes of family he thought he had lost forever. Sheriff Tom, meanwhile, remained vigilant, visiting Walter often, not just out of duty but out of friendship, because he had come to admire the old man's resilience and the way he carried dignity even in frailty, and he admitted one evening as they sat together that Duke's actions had changed not only the town but him personally, making him reflect on how often he had overlooked the quiet needs of the vulnerable. Walter chuckled at that, saying in his gravelly voice that sometimes it took a dog to remind men of their humanity, and Duke, as if agreeing, gave a single bark that made both men laugh. Yet beneath the laughter lay a quiet truth Walter could not ignore. His health was failing, the chains and the humiliation had taken more out of him than anyone realized, and there were nights when pain and fatigue made him wonder how much time he had left, but instead of fearing the end he felt strangely at peace, because he now knew he would not leave this world forgotten or alone. One evening the town organized a small parade in his honor, nothing extravagant, just neighbors walking together with flags and banners, veterans young and old marching down Main Street, and at the center Walter sat in a chair on a decorated float with Duke beside him. The dog's ears perked proudly as if he knew he was part of history, and as the crowd clapped and cheered Walter raised a trembling hand, his eyes misting over, for never in his life had he felt so deeply seen, not even in the days when medals were pinned to his chest. That night he could not sleep, overwhelmed by the gratitude that swelled in his chest, and he whispered to Duke that perhaps his story had found its ending not in bitterness but in redemption, and Duke pressed close, letting out a soft sigh that spoke louder than words. But redemption was not just for Walter. The young men who had chained him, now serving their sentences, began to work in the community under supervision, repairing homes of other veterans, cleaning public spaces, and though at first the townsfolk glared at them with disdain, slowly, grudgingly, some began to soften as they saw genuine change in their demeanor, and even Walter, when asked how he felt about it, said simply that if they had truly learned, then perhaps their cruelty could birth compassion. His forgiveness astonished many, but it also challenged them to rise above vengeance, to understand that healing required more than punishment, it required growth. Duke became the symbol of that lesson because wherever he went he was greeted with affection, townsfolk patting his head, children running up to hug him, veterans saluting him as though he were one of their own, and in his steady brown eyes people saw the reflection of loyalty, a loyalty that reminded them daily to stand by one another. As summer ripened into autumn, Walter spent his days surrounded by visits, warmth, and the hum of life that had once deserted him, and though his body grew weaker, his spirit seemed to glow brighter, for he had found not just respect but belonging, and he told Sheriff Tom one crisp evening under the orange leaves that he was ready for whenever the Lord decided to call him, because he now knew that his story had left a mark, not in history books but in the hearts of his people. And though Tom tried to protest, saying they still needed him, Walter only smiled softly and stroked Duke's head, whispering that the town still had Duke to remind them, that the dog had become their guardian as much as his, and as Duke leaned against him, eyes half closed with quiet trust, the sheriff realized Walter was right. As the winter crept into Briarwood, with its long nights and breath turning into mist, Walter Briggs felt the slow decline of his body more keenly than ever before, yet what might have once filled him with dread now brought him an unexpected calm, for he had already witnessed the change he longed to see in his community, and each morning when he woke to the sight of Duke curled faithfully at his feet, he whispered a small prayer of gratitude that he was granted another day to savor the warmth of companionship and the kindness of his neighbors, who never let him feel alone. Duke had grown even more protective in these months, sensing Walter's frailty, walking more slowly by his side, lying closer at night, and often nudging him gently when the old man coughed or struggled for breath, and Walter would smile through the pain, murmuring to his dog that he was the truest soldier he had ever known. Sheriff Tom continued to visit daily, sometimes bringing meals, sometimes just sitting silently as Walter shared memories of the battlefield or stories of his long, hard life. And Tom, though a man of few words, listened with respect, realizing more and more that every sentence carried not only wisdom but the weight of sacrifice, and that to sit with Walter was to sit with history itself. As word of Walter's condition spread quietly, townsfolk began to stop by more frequently, bringing food, blankets, or simply their company, and though Walter initially protested that he was no charity case, he soon came to accept that these gestures were not pity but love, and he began to see the faces of the townspeople not as strangers who had once overlooked him, but as family who had finally remembered him. One evening, near Christmas, the children of Briarwood surprised him by gathering outside his farmhouse, singing carols beneath the cold night sky, their small voices rising into the air while Duke barked softly in rhythm, and Walter, wrapped in a blanket on his porch, felt tears roll down his weathered cheeks, whispering that he had never known such peace even in his youth, that the music of innocent voices was a balm no medicine could ever provide. Yet time, relentless and unyielding, pressed forward, and Walter knew his strength waned with each passing week, his walks shorter, his breaths more labored, and though the townsfolk urged him to see doctors in the city, he refused, saying quietly that he had lived his life fully now and would rather meet his end at home with Duke than in a sterile hospital bed among strangers. Duke seemed to understand this, never leaving his side, refusing even food at times until Walter coaxed him, and the bond between them grew into something almost sacred, a wordless language of glances, touches, and shared silences that spoke volumes to anyone who saw them together. One late January night, a fierce storm swept across Briarwood, rattling windows and coating the fields in heavy snow, and when neighbors checked on Walter the next morning, they found him sitting in his chair by the fireplace, blanket drawn up to his chin, eyes half closed with exhaustion yet still alive, Duke curled tightly at his feet as though shielding him from the cold, and Walter managed a weak smile, telling them not to worry, that he was simply saving his strength. But deep down everyone knew the time was near, and so over the following days, people came in quiet streams to pay respects, to hold his hand, to thank him for his service and his forgiveness, and though Walter tired easily, he tried to respond to each with a kind word, sometimes lifting his hand weakly to pat a child's head or nod in gratitude, and Duke never moved from his place, watching each visitor with steady eyes that seemed to demand they tread softly around his master. Sheriff Tom spent long nights by his side, sometimes dozing in a chair, sometimes reading old letters aloud, and once, when Walter was too weak to speak much, he placed Tom's hand on Duke's head and whispered with trembling breath that when the time came, the town must look after Duke, for the dog had given more loyalty and love than most men, and he deserved not to be alone. Tom promised firmly that Duke would always be cared for, and Walter's eyes glistened with relief before sleep claimed him again. The end came quietly one dawn in early February, when the frost still clung to the windows and the fields lay silent under a blanket of snow. Walter's breathing grew shallow, his grip on the blanket loosening, and with Duke's head resting gently on his knee, he exhaled one last time, his face calm, almost smiling as if he had simply drifted into a dream. When Sheriff Tom arrived moments later, summoned by a neighbor, he found Duke sitting perfectly still beside Walter, eyes fixed on his master's face, refusing to move even when touched, and for a long time no one had the heart to separate them, until finally Tom knelt, wrapped an arm around the dog, and whispered that Walter had gone to rest, and Duke, after a long moment, let out a single mournful howl that echoed across the silent farm and made grown men's eyes sting with tears. The funeral that followed was unlike any Briarwood had seen in decades, with townsfolk, veterans, officials, and children all gathering to honor the man who had once been forgotten but was now remembered as a pillar of quiet strength. And as they lowered Walter into the ground with folded flags and solemn prayers, Duke stood close by, watching with an expression that seemed almost human in its grief, and when the final salute was fired, the dog pressed his nose to the earth as though giving one last farewell. Afterward, Tom took Duke into his own home, but he quickly realized that Duke belonged not to him alone but to the whole town, for everywhere he went people greeted him as though carrying a piece of Walter's spirit, and the children in particular would often whisper that Duke was still guarding them the way he had once guarded his master. And perhaps in some way he was, for in every wag of his tail, in every steady step through the streets of Briarwood, Duke carried forward the legacy of loyalty, sacrifice, and dignity that Walter Briggs had lived and died for, ensuring that the story would never fade, not from the town, not from the children who grew up hearing it, and not from the hearts of those who had finally learned what it meant to honor a man in life as much as in death. In the weeks that followed Walter's funeral, Briarwood seemed to carry a new kind of silence, not empty or cold but heavy with reflection, as if every street and every porch remembered the old veteran who had once been overlooked yet left such a profound mark in his final months, and at the center of it all was Duke, whose steady presence became both reminder and comfort, a living echo of the loyalty that had defined Walter's life, and people found themselves watching the dog with a respect usually reserved for monuments or holy places. Sheriff Tom kept his word, giving Duke a home in his house, but it soon became clear that Duke was not content to stay confined to one place. Each morning after breakfast he would nudge at the door, and once let out, he would walk the familiar path down to Walter's farmhouse, sit on the porch for hours as if waiting, then patrol the edges of the field before returning to town, and folks began to quietly remark that Duke was still standing watch, still guarding the memory of the man he had loved. Children who used to avoid the old veteran's land now accompanied Duke on his walks, leaving little tokens on the porch, drawings, ribbons, carved wooden toys, saying it was for Walter, and the dog accepted their presence with a calm dignity that made the children feel as though they were participating in something important, something sacred. Adults, too, began to change their habits. Men who once hurried past the farmhouse would pause to tip their hats toward the porch. Women bringing baskets of food for Tom would leave an extra loaf on Walter's table even though no one lived there anymore, and slowly what had been a neglected piece of land became a quiet memorial, alive because of the devotion of a single animal who refused to let the world forget. Tom noticed that Duke seemed to sense the moods of the people around him, approaching grieving widows with a soft nudge, joining children at play with gentle patience, even lying at the steps of the church on Sundays as if making sure everyone left in safety, and soon the townsfolk began calling him the sheriff's deputy, though many whispered that he was more than that he was the soul of Briarwood itself. One spring afternoon the mayor invited Tom and Duke to a town meeting, where they officially declared Walter's birthday a day of remembrance for all veterans, and Duke, sitting proudly beside Tom as the announcement was made, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, lifting his head high, eyes gleaming in the light of the lanterns as though he were bearing witness for Walter himself. Life went on in the town as life always does, but there was a gentleness to it now, a quiet accountability, for whenever tempers flared or bitterness threatened to resurface, someone would invariably glance toward Duke, who was often sitting nearby with steady patience, and the anger would fade, replaced by shame at forgetting the lessons Walter's story had taught them. Farmers who had once quarreled over water rights began to cooperate, business owners who had scorned charity started small funds for struggling families, and the church pews filled more steadily, not out of fear but out of a renewed sense of community, and though no one said it outright, most agreed that the change was Duke's doing, for he carried the weight of Walter's sacrifice in his quiet, steadfast eyes. Yet Duke was still only a dog and the years pressed on him as well, the black in his coat turning to gray, his steps slowing though his spirit remained unbroken, and Tom often worried about what would happen when Duke too was gone, whether the town would slip back into its old neglect, whether Walter's memory would fade like so many others. But the children who had grown up alongside Duke seemed to promise otherwise, for they spoke often of the stories Walter had told, passed down through their parents, and they treated Duke not as a pet but as a guardian, their companion in every season, so that by the time they were young adults themselves, they already carried within them the conviction that the old man who once sat forgotten on a porch was in fact one of Briarwood's greatest heroes. There was one night in particular, nearly 3 years after Walter's passing, when Duke once again stunned the town. A fire had broken out in the storage barn near the edge of Main Street, flames licking dangerously close to the houses, and before anyone could react, Duke was already racing through the smoke, barking furiously to rouse the families inside, even darting into a back alley to tug at a child's coat until the boy stumbled out into the safety of the night air. And when the townsfolk gathered afterward, coughing from the smoke but grateful to be alive, they realized it was Duke who had first raised the alarm, Duke who had saved them, and as they looked at him standing singed but unharmed with Tom by his side, they swore openly that Walter's dog was as much a hero as the man himself. From that day forward, Duke was no longer just a guardian of memory but a legend in his own right, and Briarwood embraced him fully, feeding him, sheltering him, honoring him with stories that would be told long after his paws no longer traced the streets. Sheriff Tom, watching the bond between dog and town grow ever stronger, sometimes thought that fate had chosen Duke not only to save Walter that night beneath the tree but to save the heart of Briarwood itself, to remind its people of dignity, compassion, and courage. And though he knew the day would come when Duke too would lie beneath the earth, he trusted now that the lessons would remain, planted deep in the souls of those who had been changed by both man and dog, ensuring that their legacy would live forever in the quiet strength of the town they had healed together years past. And Duke, once the vigorous guardian who patrolled Walter's porch in the town's streets with tireless energy, grew slower with age, his steps less steady, his eyes clouding with the milky haze of time, yet even in his decline there remained a dignity about him, a reminder that his life had been shaped not by comfort but by duty, and the people of Briarwood responded with a devotion equal to his own. Building ramps at Tom's house so he could climb the porch with ease, cooking special meals to keep his strength, and often gathering children around him to stroke his fur as though touching a living piece of history. By now, every child in town had heard the story, how an old veteran had once been chained to a tree, forgotten and mocked, until the sheriff's dog saved him, and how that single act had not only freed a man but awakened an entire community. And Duke became the bridge between the past and the present, the living thread that bound their daily lives to the sacrifice and love of Walter Briggs, and people spoke of him in hushed tones as if he were more than mortal, a symbol of loyalty and grace. Sheriff Tom, older himself and carrying gray in his beard, often sat beside Duke on the porch at dusk, gazing out over the fields, and he would murmur to the dog that Walter would be proud of them both, proud of the way Briarwood had changed, proud of the way his story was now a lesson passed from lips to ears like scripture. And Duke would press his head against Tom's leg as if to agree. Then came a winter harsher than most, when the snow lay heavy on the roofs and the wind howled like a wounded animal across the fields, and Duke, though warm in his blankets and cared for tenderly, began to slip further into frailty, refusing food more often, sleeping longer, his once powerful bark reduced to a low rumble that still carried the same weight of authority though his body could no longer match it, and the town knew in its collective heart that his time was near. On one quiet evening, with the first buds of spring struggling against the frost, Duke lay curled in front of the fireplace at Tom's house, breathing shallowly, his eyes half shut, and the sheriff, sensing the end, sat with him through the night, holding his head gently, whispering that he was not alone, that he had given everything and more, that he would be remembered forever. And as dawn broke with a faint blush of light across the horizon, Duke exhaled one final breath, his body relaxing into stillness, his spirit departing with the same quiet dignity that had defined his life. When the news spread, Briarwood mourned as though it had lost one of its own kin. Businesses closed for the day, the church bells tolled slowly, and people lined the streets in silence as Tom carried Duke's body through town, wrapped in the very blanket Walter had once used, children trailing with flowers in their hands, adults bowing their heads not only in grief but in gratitude for the life of a creature who had been more faithful than many men. They buried him beside Walter at the edge of the farmhouse where the fields opened wide to the sky, placing a small carved stone above his grave inscribed simply with the words "Loyal Friend, Eternal Guardian." And as the townsfolk stood together, tears streaming down their faces, it felt as though a chapter of their lives had closed, yet the lesson remained carved deeper than stone, etched into their souls. Over time, stories of Walter and Duke grew into legend, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, told around hearths in winter and beneath stars in summer, and though details shifted with the telling, the heart of it never changed. That a forgotten man was redeemed by love, and a dog taught an entire town what it meant to be human. Briarwood thrived in the years that followed, its people kinder, more patient, more willing to reach for one another in times of need, and visitors often remarked on the unusual warmth of the community, unaware that it had been forged in the crucible of sorrow, loyalty, and redemption, unaware that every smile and every act of generosity was a ripple of the story that had begun with chains and ended with freedom. Sheriff Tom, in his later years, would sometimes walk to the farmhouse and sit between the two graves, speaking softly to his old friends, telling them of the town's progress, of the new children born, of the harvests and festivals, and though no sound ever answered, he felt in his heart that their spirits listened, that they remained guardians still, watching from beyond, their bond unbroken. And so the tale of Walter Briggs and Duke the dog lived on, not confined to memory but alive in the choices, the kindness, and the courage of those who carried it forward, proof that even the most broken life can ignite a light strong enough to change an entire world, and that sometimes salvation comes not from power or wealth, but from the steadfast heart of a loyal companion who refused to let love be forgotten. The end.